Thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you, everyone who's here, and especially those of you who are in person. I feel really bad that I'm not in person. I am 2 weeks away from my due date. So I am medically advised to not leave Jacksonville Beach right now. But I would love to have shared the afternoon with you guys. I hear some familiar voices and heard some of you guys as you were walking in. So miss you all and just saying hello. And for everybody else, thank you. And thank you so much for joining today. Um, Super grateful for your attendance. So, as was mentioned, I have been working with Dr. Nia Morales and also with Dr. Matt Hallett. He's my co-advisor. I've been working in the Human Dimensions Lab. And basically, throughout the past 2 years, I have been going back and forth between this Estero Hondo region in Puerto Plata in Dominican Republic. I was born into the Dominican Republic, but this area, as you'll see, is pretty far from my the city where I was born in. And Jacksonville Zoo and Gardens for the past 2 years has also been supporting my work there. So super grateful to them as well as Conservation Nation that has supported some of this work as well. So I provided just a quick outline. Basically, the talk is separated into three parts. First, I'm going to share a little bit about Antillean manatee threats. What do they look like throughout the Caribbean region? But of course, I'm going to focus on this northwestern region of the Dominican Republic. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about my process of working with local stakeholders and essentially how this co-creation small project even came to be. Um, I'm going to be honest, there's no, everything I'm going to talk about is really high level findings. So if you get really excited about statistical outputs, this is not the talk. I'm sorry. And then I hope I hope I'm gonna just like manage that expectation now. And then last, I'm gonna just share a little bit about how I went about working with local stakeholders, but also different partners here in the US to create this environmental guide. Yeah. So to get started, starting really high level, because sometimes this can be confusing. There's three living species of manatees today. There's the Amazonian manatees. They're really small, really cute, shiny, dark ones in the Amazon. Then there's the West African manatee. Think of regions like Benin, near mangroves. They hang out in very, very similar habitats than the manatees that we are more accustomed to in the Caribbean and Florida region. And then we have the West Indian manatee. So the West Indian manatee is separated into two subspecies. Essentially, we're talking about the individuals who are geographically dispersed around Florida and the North Atlantic region of the US for the most part. And then there's what we call the Antillean manatee or Caribbean manatee. And those are dispersed throughout the Caribbean. So you can see they have a huge demographic space. And this map is a little bit outdated, but essentially what it drives and what the point that it makes is that basically the Florida populations, even if you are familiar with what happened with the unusual mortality event of 2021, for the most part have been rebounding for the past 20 years. In early 2000, there were about 2,000 Florida manatees accounted for or estimated. And by 2021, even today, they're still estimating there's about 7,000 to 8,000. So a huge rebound for a marine mammal with such low reproductive output. But then when you compare that to the individuals that are dispersed throughout the Caribbean, you can see if you look at the trend populations by country and the color, that for the most part, estimated populations are declining and there's very, very little data to support where they really stand. Um, as you can imagine, doing an estimate of these populations is really difficult. So aerial assessments is the way that we track them here in Florida. And you can imagine that being able to do that across like 18 different Caribbean nations is pretty difficult. So there was a recent one in Honduras, one in the Dominican Republic, which I'll talk about a little bit, but it's really actually hard to get these numbers. And for the most part, we think these numbers are declining. Biggest threat today would be bycatch. So that's the bycatch through gill nets for the most part, these like dragging gill nets. Habitat fragmentation, of course, as you can think about the Caribbean, expansion of coastal territories, tourism, habitat fragmentation plays a huge part in the way that manatees use coastal habitats. And that's actually pretty similar to what we see here in Florida. Um, Hunting, so in a lot of Caribbean countries, including the Dominican Republic, hunting manatees for food has been historically a part of culture practice for various reasons, some of which are attached to just livelihood, but some of them have cultural backgrounds, as in like building amulets, good luck, maybe that they are good for some sort of medicinal cures, primarily seizures, is what I've heard in the area that I work in, and general congestion. And that's really like manatee bones. And then, of course, increasingly boat collisions. The more you see motorized watercraft vessels, just like we see here in Florida, the more likely that a manatee and that watercraft vessel are going to end up meeting and the manatee being hurt. So wildlife injury is also another reason for their decline. So in the Dominican Republic, the manatee has been legally protected, just like in many other countries, since 1938. Right? If you've worked in a Caribbean or Latin country, it's usually not the legal regulation that's the problem. It's the enforcement and how we go about looking at these policies and enforcing them on a day-to-day basis. So La Ley de Pesca from 1938, basically the law of catch is what protected them early in the 1900s. But they were considered federally endangered since 2011. And the drivers of manatee decline are very, very similar to the ones that you see throughout the Caribbean. So collision, hunting, entanglement, those are all parts of what shapes how manatees have declined throughout on the island. So the country estimation has been 0 to 50 manatees, but there hasn't been a real assessment since the 1980s, with the last one being conducted this past year by a team that I'll talk about in a second. But when you look at historical hotspots, this northwestern region, I don't think I have a pointer. I don't know if you can see you can't. That's okay. Where you see the area that says Montecristi and La Isabela, this is where I've been working. This is from a study of 2019 that just essentially looked at where there were records of manatees without doing an actual assessment of. And this is an area where manatees have been seen breeding, resting, traveling throughout what is recognized as the history of the Dominican Republic pretty consistently when you compare it to other regions throughout the country. So just taking a quick step back of like who is working on manatees in the country, the reality of it is very similar to other Latin and Caribbean countries. You really need a strong push from NGOs, even private sector and foundations. The government has not been historically very involved in the protection or the rehabilitation of animal populations, and manatees included, just among many others. But there has been a history of just the capture of the animal with no proper release protocol. And so in the past few years, Clearwater Marine Research, coming from Clearwater Marine Aquarium, Dr. Anmati has been leading this effort with Dr. Buddy Powell, who lead a lot of the research that goes on here in Florida. She's part of my committee, but they've been working with Fundemar, which is a national NGO. They were first to basically identify these 3 individuals that have been in the National Aquarium for about 8 years, were rescued as orphans and were never released for many, many reasons, some of which, like, there's no protocol, there was no capacity for monitoring, and then it becomes a huge social debacle, right? People fall in love with these animals. It's not a huge country, so people are sort of enamored with the animal and don't know what happens. And also the risks of release are very real. And so just want to point out their strategy because it's really been more of a social movement strategy than a very biological one. they did get the approval from the government to release and monitor and track the animals, but they've been doing this sort of hand in hand with a journalist who's very much liked in the country. So all of these aerial pictures are from him. Just want to credit him. I do not take good pictures. Um, he has been the person who's been sort of tracking this, even made a documentary, and has really been pushing for the social support of wildlife release in general, because it's not something that's socially common or a social norm within the country. So, like I said, they did get the capacity to do this aerial census, and they're building a lot of government support nationwide, but it has huge geographical limitations. Yes, the Dominican Republic is an island, and yes, it's smaller than a lot of places, but it's also not very as small as Puerto Rico, right? Like you can cover Puerto Rico in 2 hours. If I show you the map of the Dominican Republic, and you look at that far eastern region where it says Saona Island, this is where this NGO has been operating. Whereas the area that has the most productive manatee population is all the way in the northwestern region, almost close to Haiti. So to get from this corner to the other corner of the island, we're talking about a 9-hour drive. It's not that simple. Sort of have your eyes on everything and monitor everything and working there. So this was the area that one was identified as a pretty important biological area, but also an area that has a lot of historic distrust, which I'll share a little bit why. So it's a marine mammal sanctuary, which means it's a Category 1 area now. And that looks pretty similar to what we would call a sanctuary here in the United States. Essentially, activities are legally restricted to education and research activities. But historically, since the 1930s, it was a national park. So this is an area where people have, it's a lagoon, it's a massive lagoon, and has been used for harvest for the most part. Fisheries, the economy is pretty dependent or was pretty dependent on this area for day-to-day living. And a lot of changes happened in the past 20 years that essentially restricted access to the space. And then there's been challenges in the day-to-day management of the space. And I'll talk a little bit about that. That's kind of what I'm going to get at. The other part of this is, of course, this is a story about manatees, but there's more than 40 endangered species within the area that we're talking about. And so it has a huge biodiversity gradient. Has dry forests, it has subtropical humid forests, mangroves, seagrass beds, and coral reefs. It's a productive biological region in general. And then when you look at it from an economic perspective, it also has resources that used to be really common on the island, right? These like untouched beaches that are prime and pristine and are increasingly decreasing just because of tourist expansion. So the Dominican Republic now has the 9th highest GDP in Latin America, really only falling behind larger countries. And most of that is because they've put in a lot of time and effort and money into touristic expansion. So if you think about all these inclusive hotels, the effort and time and that goes into building them usually means that a lot of these coastal habitats become completely destroyed in the process of it. This area is fortunate and unfortunate to be completely isolated, so it hasn't really been used for those reasons. And so for the most part, tourism there is really locally driven and by people that generationally did not have access to practice internal tourism, and now they do. And so this is not the area where you see a lot of international travel in the first place. So I took this from the conservation planning class because I figured a bunch of you all would be here because we took this class together. So if you just summarize this area, which some of you are familiar with, some of the threats of the area, really the uncontrolled growth of tourism, if you want to just sum it all up. You also have expanding agricultural practices, right? People make money here because of aquatic harvest and ag. Ag is a huge thing, for the most part tobacco, and it requires a lot of really excessive pesticide, fertilizer usage, and water extraction. because this is a dry area. And so water extraction is pretty prevalent, and I'll talk about it a little bit more. And then this number 3 is this extraction of plants from the dry forest, some of it being driven by illegal demand for wood, some of it being driven by Haiti's demand for illegal extraction, some of it local and some of it international. And then, of course, the economy really is driven by fisheries. But I guess what makes it different is that in the past 20 or 30 years, the techniques for harvesting wildlife have changed, marine wildlife. So in the past, what I hear really often is that, you know, these were artisanal methods of catching fish. Really, people would dive, but they weren't using any sort of technology to do so. Whereas now they are trying to maximize the amount of fish and capture that they can get. So they're pretty open to, you know, going on Amazon and buying a huge one of those like these like gill nets that are really fine, will catch anything, are super thin, very accessible now, whereas they weren't before. And then they're also really open to using these homemade compressors. So these compressors are essentially a diving tank, except they're super dangerous. And they utilize essentially a beer keg to compress air, and then a hose from your backyard to give you the air. As you can imagine, that's extremely dangerous, but some of the people are maximizing what they can catch by using these practices. So still very much artisanal. There's not a commercial practice of catching fish in the area, but the practices have definitely been amped up. And then just to like everything that I'm going to talk about moving forward is everything regarding these local threats that can be maybe addressed and talked about at a local level, but I don't want to miss the big picture here. In the area, there has been a huge extraction of water resources for agriculture. And this is also a slide we used in conservation planning. So it's the unregulated extraction of waters like Rio Baja Bonico, where these rivers used to flow and now they don't. And for the most part, it's because there's farms surrounding them that are taking water out every single day with really very little regulation. That has also driven some of the loss of biodiversity in the area, which affects people and affects manatees, of course, because there's an aquifer that feeds into that lagoon. So now getting at the more local level, which gets at this guide that we ended up putting together. Some of the really local threats, and these are just activities from people, is this unregulated tourism in the buffer zones of the sanctuary. The sanctuary itself is pretty small. It's 22 kilometers square. But the area, and I'll show you a map in a second, is much larger. And that's what encompasses what used to be and continues to be the national park. But everything in the national park is really much unregulated altogether. So there's tons of tourism. Most of it, like I said, is local. Essentially, there's really not a lot of regulation in the way that people engage with the water areas, but people are completely dependent on it. So this area is called La Ensenada. This is where people come every weekend. There is tons of harvest of trees because they're making the food by just by fogon, like that's how they make their food. And then they're also going to this place called Gallo Arena, which I'll talk about. It is about 10,000 meters to get from the area that I just showed you all the way to this island. But it is operated by about 5 or 7 companies, and these companies have no clear channel of how to get to one place to the other. So this is a picture of my cousin. This is like your average tourist. Your average tourist is going to Gallo Arena with beer cans in their hand. And for the most part, the traffic is really high because all these captains are trying to maximize how many people they can get to the island and back. It's essentially fast and cheap tourism. So there's really not a lot of motivators to go slow to reduce wildlife collisions. And every year they add more boats into this really not that big of a beach. Of course, manatees and other wildlife are traveling between the area here on the east side of the sanctuary all the way through those mangroves. And so this is another driver of wildlife collisions. This is a picture from when I was there last time in just this past June. And so wildlife collisions happen, manatee wildlife collisions happen The problem is that there's a lot of very sort of like a hush hush mentality behind when an animal actually is hurt or when an animal dies, right? Because manatees can become injured by a water vessel, become injured, become rehabbed, and go back and be normal. We do that in Florida every single day. But here, there is quite a fear of reporting something happening. And so, if you talk to anyone about this, any fisherman is going to tell you this was probably a very old manatee. This was probably a sick manatee. So, there's a huge shame in reporting. The other part is that these mangroves that are here, where you see manglares de Punta Rusia, they're essentially using this as a continuation of the tourist experience. So they go from Cayo Arena to the mangroves and they go as fast as possible through the mangroves because the idea is that you're optimizing tourist experience by going as fast as possible through the mangroves. And so, of course, that's all manatee habitat. And in the past, they used to use what's now called the sanctuary to do the exact same thing. But because now there's regulation, they've sort of looked elsewhere to see where they can still create this business and generate subsistence from it. The number two is actual unregulated construction inside the Category 1 area. So this area, like I mentioned, was a park. And so there's people who have plots of land here. They've had them for generations. This is waterfront view land. They are not blind to what is happening throughout the country. And they're very much aware that this land has market value, that right now it's not being optimized. So a lot of the people are just sort of lying low until the government eases up. That's kind of what I hear all the time. They're waiting till the government eases up and then they can sell this property. In the meantime, there's very little regulation. So they're burning, they're growing tobacco, and they are having livestock utilize it to roam when, just like free roam livestock, like you guys are probably used to seeing. And so with this has like had a huge cumulative effect, even in this small Category 1 area. You can see that these plots of land are essentially stripped. They use pretty aggressive fertilizers, pesticide in order to grow tobacco. And so this is another thing that's driving biodiversity decline in this space as well. So in this second part, I'm just going to talk to you all. I've already shared a little bit about the perceptions that people of the area have, but essentially characterizing what community-based solutions could look like and what are real barriers that are perceived by people who live there. So very much focused on the local perspective of the area. The people who I was really targeting and I've been working with the most are fishers, of course. These are the people that are making a living off the sea, off the lagoon. They are divers. They also use gill nets. There's farmers. These are the people that are, have these plots of land that are within the protected region. And then there's cattle ranchers as well. There's tons of other stakeholders that I've been talking to, but these are probably the people that have the highest impact. And some of the questions that I've asked them, just big picture, obviously not directly asking them this, but their perception of what positive and negative management of the area looks like. What do they want to see in the future? What do they suggest for management? What could actually work for this community? And I am trying to characterize their relationship with this area. So one group that I want to share super high level information about is these oyster collectors and the divers. This is a super weird sub-target group because they've sort of gotten around all the Category 1 level regulations. For whatever reason, the government said, you guys can keep working in the lagoon. Everyone else got kicked out, but you guys can keep collecting oysters here. And as long as you're free diving without using anything else, you can continue to work there. And so for the most part, this is only like 15 people. It's a very cultural practice on both ends. And it seems like these individuals have a huge stake in keeping the mangroves alive. Obviously, that's what they're making their living off of. And they see these manatees as their coworkers. Most of the like really in-depth information that I've gotten in terms of where the manatees are, where they're dispersed, what parts of the lagoon they like to hang out in have come from these groups because they basically live and breathe this area and they are allowed to do so. The second group is the fishers. For the most part, the fishers have very inconsistent opinions about the usage of the lagoon. And that actually drives conflict among them because some of them are very much proponents of using gill nets inside the area. There's a sort of perception that they have a very intimate relationship with manatees, um, and that they know what a manatee will and will not engage with. Um, they have skepticism over the management. The people who manage the area now have political appointments. So that only drives that divide between what the government is doing with the area and the people who live there. And then overall, there's a sort of perception that the wildlife's well-being is being put over their well-being, mainly because the lagoon is really productive, and this is a place that they would historically go for harvest if seas were rough, um, and just when one type of species is off season, this is a place that they could go and still find something that is in season. And so there's really a lot of conflict between the fishers and the rangers in this case. And then, like I mentioned, there's the buffer plot landowners. They're continuing to harvest within the area. They're continuing to grow tobacco, and essentially their perspective is the government should be paying them out. They created a Category 1 area and no one gave them money for it, so it continues to be their land. What particularly drives conflict is that there are special permits, that's what they're called unofficially. Um, and these special permits have happened about 3 times within the Category 1 area. They've been given to foreigners who probably paid an extra amount for that permit, and they've been able to build small little hotels to drive ecotourism and tourism into the area. And so, as you can imagine, people who've been there for generations and generations really don't feel like that's an equitable way of managing the land. And so, obviously, every time this happens, it sort of adds more fuel to the fire, and they feel more agency to manage this land more aggressively because somebody else is building a full, concrete hotel in the area. And like I said, they have this mentality of we're waiting for the land to regain value. So just to sum it all up, in these like very high level outcomes of what I've gotten, basically there's a huge perception of corruption and distrust. People fear that the area's protection was not really done for protection's sake, and really more to politicize the area and have the government have a stronger sort of like hold over the space. They fear that it really hasn't protected manatees at all. There's conflict between local community members, and by that I mean the rangers and the fishers for the most part. They feel like if the area is to be optimized for tourism, which a lot of people want it to be, then there's a huge infrastructure deficit and not a lot of people paying attention to it. So at the core of it, though, what the local community has felt is that there's really a lack of local support or value for the natural space. And this was really interesting because it came really from older people that I've talked to. And I'll share a little bit about how I gathered this as well. But essentially, they're saying, 20 years ago, this area became non accessible. And now we have a group of youth who have a knowledge deficit and really have no positive value toward the space. They don't really see the space as adding value at all. And so when we talk about the future and when we think about how do you create sustainable management of the space, you really need to get people from the younger generations on board. So essentially, and I'll talk about how the guide itself became the thing that they wanted to do. But when I asked them about, who should be supportive of this, they really felt, regardless of the fact that they have a lot of disagreements with each other, that rangers should really be on board, that tourist operators should be on board, and that fishers should be on board. And so I had meetings with different people once I had the original focus group meetings, and I sort of triangulated that this was the interest of the main stakeholders, that they wanted to create a guide to address these problems. really to bring the youth in and to develop more positive value sets towards the space. And so, like many of you, I did a few focus group meetings. I really wanted to know what are the opportunities, what are the barriers, what are the things that could be done. And of course, a lot of the obstacles that I mentioned were brought up. But then when we got to the nitty gritty of what can you all do and what can the community really take part in, they really wanted to essentially highlight their own ecological knowledge. A lot of the people felt like I worked my entire life there. I know what's there. I know what's important about this space. And today, really, that value isn't being recognized. And it would be great if we had some sort of tool that captured that from our perspective, not from a management perspective. So at that point, and after those meetings, I got together a bunch of people that I essentially felt like were influential in the space. These were educators. These were members of the Ministry of the Environment, even though, like I mentioned, there's some conflict there. This was not a group that all liked each other, let me be clear. But they all were behind the idea that there should be a tool that has the voices of people from Estero Hondo that talks about the space. Rangers brought in local business owners, fishers, which were incredibly important, and then touristic guides. So these are the people going to and from Cayo Arena. And just to point out like some of the really key differences, this family here that you see in the second picture to the left, I've been staying with him every time I go. He is one of the most prominent fishermen in the area. He's the most respected person in the community, 100%. He's one of the people who believes that gill nets and management with active fisheries should happen in the lagoon. And he was able to put that aside and say, let's just focus on the fact that the place has ecological value and talk about it from that frame. And he was probably one of the most active members as a collaborator in creating this guide. And so just wanted to stop and say that because I think oftentimes in conservation, we think, well, if we can't agree on everything, then we can't move forward at all. And I felt like that really wasn't the case with this group. They have all had some sort of history of conflict and they were still able to work together. So after I got back from these multiple trips and had all this great information, I was like, yeah, I don't really have any money and I don't know how to create a guide at all. So I just want to point out that it was really important for me to, yes, I generated what the local community was looking to see, but then I really was not accounting for time or expertise to deliver on those needs because I'm not an educator of any capacity. I don't have that background in me. Really needed some funding in order to get this together. And then, of course, I had to rely on other people to help me. So I, one, relied heavily on people like Yule, like people like Bella, who are here today to give me information about mangroves and dry forests, which I'm certainly not an expert on. I relied on people like manatee technicians who take care of rehabilitating manatees every day at the zoo that I worked with. And then I worked with an intern who was getting her master's degree on educational storytelling and art from a master's degree program in Ohio to really help me collate this data and work with the stakeholders, because what I was really focusing on is the stakeholder involvement part of it. So I really got to just focus on that and have other people sort of deliver some of this other factual data that might have been needed throughout the process. So this is a redundant slide, but I've used it a million times. I think it's important. Why are we developing an environmental guide by and with communities? One, because number one is they wanted it. They felt that there was a local ecological knowledge that they could pass down from their generation to another. The second part is it improves the social diffusion, right? If the information is their own and not imposed by somebody else, then it's much more likely to be taken up by the community and then therefore have community ownership. So that was at the end of the day what I convinced me to say, yep, this is a good idea if this is really what they want. So once we knew that there was funding, once we knew that this guide was something that they wanted, then we had a series of meetings, which I designed not by myself, but actually with a principal. She's a retired principal of the school. Basically, the world loves her in that community. And she really was the one who guided people into these conversations. And so really it was a joy to just like sit back and help her see what she wanted to get out of the meeting and help her construct it in her needs. But essentially what came out of these meetings is that people really wanted the manatee to be the narrator of the story. There's a lot of cultural pride for the manatee in the area. In fact, people are very scared that the manatee will disappear in the area. And a lot of people feel like their numbers are dwindling and they don't really know why that's happening. And so this sort of like urgency behind the manatee telling the story and the things that are driving it was really important to them. So we had multiple concept meetings. We had to work with timing, right? There's educators that work in the daytime, fishermen only come after 7. People who work for the government are like, you just have to work around their schedule. So there was multiple of these meetings. There wasn't like one time where everybody got together and had the privilege of designing the concept or vision for the guide, but we worked around it. And then for 4 to 5 months, we just developed the guide. So I went back home and we focused on this co-development model, which essentially enabled tons of open communication. So I was incorporating information from interviews. I was also incorporating information from focus meetings that I've gathered over the times that I've gone, but we also had a WhatsApp call and Zoom call. So we had a WhatsApp channel that was constantly giving information back and forth. So either the team was providing something here in the US and they were getting feedback, or the people from Estero Hondo were getting together and saying, this is the species list that makes sense, this is what we want to call them, etc. So there was a lot of back and forth there. We had Zoom calls also to sort of just like provide updates of where we were and things that needed to be changed throughout the process. So like it's very adaptive in that way. That was a challenging piece of it, just getting people on the same page, or like electricity goes out. So I wish all of that could have happened in person, but this is how we had to do it because of the constraints that we had. And then the idea was that people were inside of the natural system. They really wanted to see their stories told inside of the guide and not just a guide about nature, if that makes sense. So one of the things we relied on, and really I relied on the intern who was looking at imagery as a way of telling stories, was looking at people who wanted to talk about the area, what makes them worried about the area, what makes them happy about the area, what activities are happening there that are positive and can add value to the space. We used a lot of art. The main thing was that no one wanted a management book. No one wanted something that was very educational in the sense of like formal education. They wanted to see their images and they wanted to have a very caring, positive narrative that focused on the manatee with their voices inside of them. Like I said, the manatee was the main narrative. The manatee was telling the story, but then there was also actions and pledges that people could take. So some of it was connecting this NGO that is working nationally and putting their phone number and putting their information there so that people actually know and feel a little bit more empowered to reporting a manatee rather than feeling like this is something really hush hush and that we shouldn't call attention to when a manatee or an animal needs help. And then there was also the need to reframe the manatee. So what I found in my interviews that is that some of the population is actually horrified of this animal. If you are not a person who spends a lot of time in the water, there's a little bit of mysticism behind the animal. The lagoon is dark, the water itself is dark, and so a lot of people are not familiar with what the manatee looks like in itself. So that's where relying on the manatee technician, people from JZG, to give some creative ways of talking about the animal in the way that was not scary. was really important as well. So then in June, we essentially started deploying this test with the guide with the grant that I did have. And I'll just share some images of what that looked like. Basically, I went down because I had the copies. We had a digital copy as well, but the same people who were part of creating the guide were the ones who were holding meetings. And essentially, everyone recognized that they had a niche group that they could influence. And so they held their own meetings where they talked about the guide, what the value of the guide was. They asked me to walk them through the parts of the guide and how it can be usable for their particular group. But essentially they were holding these meetings and leading this with their groups. And I felt like that was really important for me to just not be the person talking in the room and for them to be the person talking in the room and for them to really be leading it. And then now we're in the space where we did a pre-assessment. So we asked people to take a survey before receiving the guide. 250 people received the guide, but we also had a digital version of it. And in a few months, actually next month, there'll be a post survey for those that receive the guide. I have no idea if this is going to change any sort of knowledge, any sort of attitude toward the space. But I do think it's really important for the people who said that they wanted to create this product. And when I did the assessments for the collaborators, they all felt a certain level of ownership over it. They felt like the success of the guide was really on their backs, that it was really important for it to succeed because they put some effort into it. So really the value of does this tool work isn't really so much, well, does educational materials work to influence attitude toward a sanctuary? I have no idea. But what's important, I think, about that output is for the people who want to continue engaging their communities to know if this is a good tool for them to continue doing that. Another thing is that the guide is being used by the biology professors in the schools or any sort of natural history professors. So getting their feedback about how this guide promotes their engagement about natural spaces is important, as well as the touristic operator companies. So a lot of them are owned by men who were fishers in the past, and now they employ a slew of very young, usually male, individuals who are the ones who drive people to and from Cayo Arena. So they sort of saw this as a guideline, sort of an inspiration to start talking about the wildlife that they are going by whenever they are going back and forth and they are utilizing that water space. So getting their feedback about how they engage with the guide is going to be really key to understanding the role of it. I have a link to the guide if anybody wants it. And then lastly, just lessons learned. Definitely would have been nice to have more time and resource for the co-creation process. Yes, it really took over a year to do this whole thing, but when we sat down with the collaborators, the design process, a lot of people wanted to have even more meetings about it. So I think it's interesting once you get people engaged with something, they really want more, and I agree with them. I think that the quality of it could have been improved by more conversations. It was a positive experience, at least for me and from the feedback of the collaborators, and it definitely created trust because this is an area that does not trust outsiders and does not really want to work on co-creating a lot of things with external parties. That has been sort of a pattern of the area and what makes it so difficult to engage with them, this even if you take out the fact that they're just super isolated and very far from the rest of the DR. And then last, it was really interesting to see that by doing this, a lot of landowners were now interested in addressing larger issues such as land management within their own buffer zones and their own plot areas and the things that they're willing to do or mitigate as a result of so many people showing interest in the space. So yeah, I think I still have a few more minutes. So really, I just want your thoughts. Of course, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer, but I would really love to have your thoughts, ideas. You guys work on things like this as well and different projects. that are super inspiring, and you're doing different things. So I'd love to hear a little bit about what are your suggestions for continued involvement? Um, and then what are some examples potentially that you may have of now inserting this NGO? Because at the end of the day, I work to establish trust with the group, but at the end of the day, if you want to see positive engagement and positive protection of the area, the local NGO who's really leading the charge here should be reinserted in the picture. They should be part of the long-term engagement. So I'd just love to hear your thoughts about that. And yes, that's it. More pictures of manatees being cute.